Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would do a little bit of social commentary and talk about, finally, the death of the above the knee rack pull in the YouTube fitness community. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. You know, this has been a long time coming. This is one of these trends that I have fought against and fought against and fought against. And the funny part is that I am known as being a heavy barbell guy. That's what I promote, that's what I do, that's what I tell everybody to do. Then unless you have a very good reason to work it into your program, you don't really have much use for anything but heavy barbell work and weighted body weight exercises, you know, like dips, pull-ups, things like that. That's usually what I say. 90% of people will never need anything more than those two things. I'm all about the heavy barbell work. And yet here we are with a heavy barbell movement that I denounced for years. And a lot of it kind of got kicked off because of Eric Bugenhagen, who actually I get along with just fine. He's actually got a good channel. He's a pretty knowledgeable guy. That's something I said a couple years back, that Eric actually has a pretty good grasp of overall training. The only situation I run into with Eric is that a lot of what he does is for himself as an advanced athlete. And for most people, they're not at his level, and trying to imitate his particular style of doing things might not be the best way to go. But where I will give credit there is that he's actually said that. He said, look, if you're in your first couple of years of lifting, I advise you do this or that. He's actually broken it down really well. And if most of the people who see him and want to emulate him would just follow his advice for what he says you need to do the first few years, instead of trying to imitate what he's been doing himself in his last 5 or 10 years of training, they would be a hell of a lot better off. But he really does legitimately know what he's talking about. And he just enjoyed the above the knee rack pull because he thought it was fun. It was fun to show off. It was fun to test himself on it. He actually kind of later admitted, once it kind of spiraled out of control, that it's not the best exercise. He would never recommend anyone do it in a gym with someone else's equipment, that you need to buy your own special equipment for it, your own special bars, and then you're responsible if they get damaged. And that, you know, it doesn't have good carryover to the deadlift. It's not even the best shoulder developer. That he listed other exercises that were way better. So he kind of denounced it a bit. But the problem we had is that people like AlphaDestiny ran with it and popularized it. And then we saw guys like Scott Herman start popularizing it. And that's kind of one of those other people that Scott, for a while, was actually putting out really good info. Then he jumped off into this silly ass above the knee rack pull stuff. And it kind of just spiraled out of control from there between guys like that and AlphaDestiny promoting it. But it seems to be dying off now, finally. It seems to be dying off. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact, I'm not going to take any responsibility for that other than Eric. I think maybe did come forward and talk about it more a little bit because of me, but that's not direct responsibility. He probably would have done that anyway, so I'm not going to take credit for that. But I think when Eric kind of came out and said, guys, it is actually a problematic lift. It's, you know, it puts a lot of strain on the body. It's not even that useful for anything. And he recommended other stuff for building your traps and shoulder girdle and everything else. He actually broke it down and said, look, there are better exercises. That did kind of start the ball rolling with that. And now we don't see a lot of these other guys promoting it quite as much. It's slowly creeped off. You know, unfortunately, once guys build a lot of their following, while promoting something like that, though, they can't just let it die off immediately, even though maybe their source material for it has more or less said, look, guys, it's not that great of an exercise. And I think the scary part that we saw with this lift is that you look at all the kids out here doing this exercise who really, they're not even doing a partial deadlift at the top. And they're pretty much just squatting the weight up. They're not even getting any hip hinge involved, so they're not even getting the movement pattern you would get from a deadlift or even a longer range of motion rack pull. And they're lifting this astronomical amount of weight, right? And then the whole idea is that, well, it puts a stretch on the trap, so therefore it must be making the traps and upper back grow. But they're not getting the range of motion you would get on other variations of the exercise. And people need to understand that actually does matter. It's a hell of a lot of difference between deadlifting 600 off the floor and deadlifting 600 in a perfectly upright position in terms of what happens with your scapula, your traps, and even from a isometric perspective. They're not even remotely close. Just hanging 600 pounds from your traps and moving it 2 inches is not putting the same effect on your traps that bending over is and having to pull your scapula back to lift it before you come up, right? Big difference there. So you can't even compare the two because it's pretty much a different exercise at that point, even for the trapezius, even for that isometric or stretch strength. It's a completely different exercise due to the range of motion and angles involved, even with 600 pounds. And so you see all these kids who were doing 500, 600, 700, 800 pounds who didn't even look like they lift. Right? We saw them doing this stuff, and you see their videos, and how many of those guys do you look at and think, man, that guy's been training really hard for 6 months or a year? None of them. They were all tiny, sucked up, do you even lift skinny kids. All of them. All of them. None of them look like they've been training. None of them look like they lift. They were all skinny and tiny. And yet here they are doing these heavy rack pulls, and that should have told people something. That should tell you something right there, that if these guys are lifting this much weight on this exercise, it doesn't work very well. And that's before we even get into the science of it. That should be the anecdote. That should be your observation. You see a skinny guy who looks like he doesn't lift, who looks like he probably can't deadlift 400 pounds, doing a 700-pound rack pull for 3 or 4 inches, and he doesn't look like he lifts. That should tell you that a 700-pound rack pull doesn't stimulate shit. Because it doesn't. That's really nothing. I'm going to go out on a limb and say these little short rack pulls, so you start getting to 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 1,400 pounds, are probably not doing much of anything for you. Let's just be realistic here. But that just destroys equipment, destroys your body, everything else. But you know, so do the lighter ones, and that's kind of the problem we run into with this. Not only is it an exercise that is essentially useless to you in your growth stimulation versus axial loading and recovery, it damages equipment. It hurts people, because there's a difference between building yourself up to being able to lift 600 or 700 pounds over years and years and years of training, right? You build up bone density, you build up connective tissue, you build a lot of things up. You build your core to prepare yourself to support that sort of weight through more conventional training versus just jumping right into it immediately as a novice lifter with no strength base and just loading your body and your spine with that sort of weight. There's a big difference there. You haven't built yourself up for it. The risk of injury is tremendous, and people do get hurt doing this silly stuff. It is injury prone. It does damage bars, right? There's a reason lifters all over the world and weightlifting and stuff have blocks that they pull from. There's a reason they pull off of blocks instead of pins. Pins get damaged. Bars and pins and racks get damaged by doing this stuff. You're not supposed to lift off of pins. Pins are there as a safety for in the event that you fail an exercise to keep you from dying. They are not intended to be repeatedly hit with a heavy weight. They're not intended for that. That's what blocks are designed for, that the plates themselves rest on, so that there's no metal on metal contact on the bar causing it to bend and gouge and damage. It destroys equipment. It destroys equipment. So it destroys people's body, it destroys people's equipment, and then the worst part, if you go look at what people like Dr. Mike Israetel said about it when this came up in one of his Q&As, and keep in mind, guys, Dr. Mike does have a PhD in the field, but he has competed in powerlifting, competed in bodybuilding, competes in BJJ. This is a guy with a little bit of real-world experience. And even he pointed out that because of the short range of motion involved, no matter how much weight you use, it is going to have a very limited hypertrophic potential. It is going to stimulate very, very few muscle fibers relative to what you're doing compared to a longer range of motion exercise, because it's such a limited range of motion and there's so little direct dynamic involvement in it. But the problem is that from an axial loading perspective, you are loading your body with so much weight that you're getting the recovery issues of an extremely heavy deadlift. In other words, if you do a 700-pound rack pull and your max deadlift is 400, that 700-pound rack pull puts as much recovery destroying impact upon your body as if you had deadlifted a 1-rep max for an all-out training max, right? Even if you could pull more than the 700, the effect on your recovery is the same of attempting probably a competition max deadlift. It beats up your recovery, so you gain pretty much almost no muscle stimulation effect from it, but you have to now recover from it, and it beats up your body. So from a workload or a training stimulus versus recovery model, it is an extremely inefficient exercise, probably one of the worst you can do. And even Dr. Mike kind of picks on the normal conventional deadlift for that a bit. That's why he says, while the conventional deadlift's a great exercise, you're trying to get big, it does have a limited application. And that's why most of the best programs out there that include the deadlift, including ones I have, including ones other people have, but for drug-free lifters, we don't have them do a lot of deadlift volume. And there's a reason for that, because you can't recover from a lot of deadlift volume. You can't. It has its limited use for gaining muscle mass. It's a good lift, but it's not something you can put too much work into without sacrificing a lot somewhere else. So it's not the lift that you need to focus on the most if you're trying to get as big as possible. It absolutely has a lot of strength potential, and it does have some size potential, but it's not the best economy of your recovery to do large volumes of the normal deadlift. There are alternatives out there that even he recommended, and even I admit it is true, particularly if you're in a hypertrophy or gaining phase of your training, which is where a lot of guys are all the time. A lot of guys are not peaking their strength, right? They're not worried about 1 rep max for a powerlifting meet or anything else. They're just trying to get jacked. Well, if that's the case, the normal conventional deadlift, you need to be very, very careful in how you program it. You might want to consider replacing it with a longer range of motion lighter exercise like a deficit deadlift, like a snatch grip deadlift. So I agree with people like Dr. Mike there. And so at the end of the day, guys, this whole rack pull thing, these rack pulls above the knee, has finally died out. It's finally died out. It's one of the worst trends we've had in a long time, and I think it's a good thing that we're seeing it finally die out. And hopefully the last couple of people out there, big YouTubers promoting it, will let it go ahead and fade into non-existence where it belongs. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.